Hello and welcome back to the Mrs. Money Hacker YouTube channel. I'm Megan from the blog mrsmoneyhacker.com, and in this video I'm going to talk about the psychology of money and the recipe for human happiness, as well as ways you can use this newfound understanding to build a sustainable budget without impacting your happiness. So leading on to the psychology of money, there's something that's called the fulfillment curve. And so the concept of this is that once you have enough necessities for your survival, enough niceties for your comforts and pleasures, and even enough little luxuries, we have enough, you have everything that you need. And everything outside of that is excess and actually starts to weigh you down. So it takes time and effort and cost to maintain these things that you're purchasing. And having more than enough actually starts to diminish your sense of fulfillment that you get from those items. So once you define what your own personal level of enough is, then you can start to cut away the rest. So that's just a high level concept that will help in understanding where you can cut back and actually alleviate some stress that you didn't know you had. Then there's something called lifestyle inflation. So this refers to an increase in spending when your income goes up. And usually the inflation tends to become greater every time you get a raise. And it can make it difficult to get out of debt or save for retirement or other big picture financial goals. So being aware of this can help you avoid falling subject to it. And I think it's really well described by these two graphs. So the first, if we look at average Joe, which is the average person who, as their income rises, so do their needs in quotation marks. You get a raise and you say, oh, I've got this bonus this year. I've got this. I worked hard for this. I deserve a new car, or I deserve a bigger house, or whatever it might be that you're trying to strive towards. Your lifestyle is inflating with your income, and therefore your savings never increases, and you never get to your financial independence because your needs, your expectations have risen in line with your income, and your savings have never increased. And therefore, you're never going to meet your financial goal. And then if we look at somebody who maintains their base needs as their income rises, their savings also increases exponentially. And eventually, their savings and their investments exceeds what they need to live and exceeds even their income. And you can reach this goal of financial independence much more quickly. So then on to the recipe for human happiness. So a lot of psychologists have actually dug into this and found that the common elements of happiness are things like friendship, freedom, health, meaningful work, this philosophy of life, which is what helps you decide how to react when things go wrong, community and access to a network of friendly people, and privacy. And if you take a minute and stop and think about what makes up your perfect day, or what are the top 10 things you do on a weekly basis that bring you the most happiness? How many of those actually cost money, or a lot of money? Probably not an awful lot. Like all of those things that I just mentioned about human happiness, like none of those really require money. You can work out for free. You can do meaningful work. You can pick jobs that are and obviously you can make money from jobs, so it's not even costing money, it's making you money, but you have the choice to find work that's meaningful to you. Being part of a community in your spare time, those are all things that don't cost any money. Next is a concept called the Hedonic Treadmill. And this is really well described in chapter 8 of a book called Quit Like a Millionaire. But basically goes into the brain chemistry that happens when you buy things. So I'm just going to get you to think, have you ever bought a big ticket luxury item like a new car, a new house, even something smaller like a new phone, basically luxuries, things that you don't need to survive, but they're things that are perceived to be positive changes in your life. And did those purchases make you feel good? That's because your brain detects them as positive changes to your life, and it releases a hit of dopamine, which is the pleasure hormone. And then did you notice that after you had it for a while, your happiness with the new item was very short-lived and actually started to decline over time when you had to maintain it? So, say your car broke down or you got a scratch on it, or you're something flooded in your house. Those are all things that they're additional stressors in your life, that those items that initially brought you that hit of dopamine, you're no longer getting a hit of dopamine. You're actually becoming more and more unhappy because you have these items. So those things that you brought into your life, while they give you an initial high, um, they actually start to diminish in the level of happiness that they bring you over time. So what happens is, when you buy something new, you get that initial hit of dopamine, but then your brain actually reacclimatizes its baseline. So the next time you buy a similar item, your brain expects to feel that same level, that same hit of dopamine, that same sensation that you got, the same high that you got from buying that purchase. But because your brain's baseline expectation has risen, you never get the same feeling from buying the same purchase. So you don't feel the same level of pleasure. And the same thing happens for drug users that are chasing their first high. If you've ever come across that, you never get the same impact as you did the first time you purchased something like that. And as mentioned, then as time goes on, it actually starts to weigh you down, because you're not getting any additional hits of dopamine, but your stress is going up because you have to maintain it and you have to insure it and you worry about it. And so the more stuff you own, the unhappier and more stressed you will be. And this is a kind of a bit where the concept of minimalism comes in, where the less things you have, the less you worry about, the less you have to organize, the less you have to clean. But also, you can afford to buy more quality things that, bring more enjoyment to your life for a much longer period of time. So that's just something to consider. And then also experiences. So when they looked at the level of happiness that experiences bring, each experience is different, and therefore your brain hasn't reacclimatized to that level of expectation. And so you do get that same new high each time you travel somewhere new. And you can create memories that you look back on and you re-experience that same high. You don't have to maintain experiences. You don't have to worry about experiences breaking or things like that. So actually explains why buying things versus buying experiences, you get a much better bang for your buck when you buy experiences instead of things. So the more you spend on experiences like travel and learning new skills, the happier and the more content you will be. So that's something that's really important and really powerful if you hadn't come to that realization. And then I'm going to go into a bit about different types of expenses. So you've got baseline expenses, which are your mortgage, your rent, your groceries, your utilities. These neither bring happiness or unhappiness. They're just costs for you to get by. And then there's actually some baseline expenses that decrease your happiness, like insurance or unexpected maintenance costs. And then some spending that increase your happiness. So where something new is brought into your life, it can be stuff or experiences, but as we've seen, the hit of happiness from things is temporary and it's much longer lasting for things like experiences. So understanding which expenses you have bring you the most happiness or the most unhappiness, it's really important, because then you can start to build a budget around those things and around those understandings that will be much more sustainable and maintain your level of happiness. Something else that was really interesting is that happiness is relative. So Vicki Robin, the author of the New York Times bestseller Your Money or Your Life, it's a really great book if you haven't read it. She began running finance seminars with her husband back in the 80s, I think. And she would ask the audience, how much would it take to make you happy? How much money would it take to make you happy? Stop and think about that for yourself. What is your magic number that would make you happy? And for everyone, almost everyone in the audience, in every income bracket, no matter how much they made, said that they needed double what they were making now for them to be happy. And then when they were asked to rate their happiness on a scale of 1 to 5, there was no significant difference between the top earners and the bottom earners. So people then were starting to realize that, people sitting next to them in the audience probably had the more that they thought they needed to make them happy, and it made no difference to their happiness. So that's really profound. If you're not happy with what you have and you haven't aligned your spending to the things that bring you the most happiness, then it doesn't matter what you make, your happiness isn't going to be aligned, and money won't bring you the happiness. Certainly, money can bring you comfort, and make life more comfortable, and it can certainly buy you more luxuries and things like that. But there's a tipping point where that fulfillment level, that fulfillment curve, where you've reached enough. Um, Everything after that is excess, and it doesn't make a difference. Then there was another Nobel laureate, Daniel Kahneman, I think is how you say it. In his research on money and happiness, he found that beyond a certain level of sufficiency, it was currently about $75,000 US a year. More money doesn't buy more happiness. There is that peak, that enough on that fulfillment curve, that everything after is excess and actually starts to weigh you down. So understanding those principles of the psychology of money can really help you to fine tune a budget that will be sustainable, because you're not depriving yourself. You're actually increasing your happiness, because you're only cutting out the expenses that either decrease your happiness or don't make any difference to your happiness. Or in the case of your baseline expectations readjusting, your happiness will adjust as well, as your brain chemistry actually adjusts to the new normal. So going into creating a budget that's sustainable and increases your happiness, the first step is to know where your money is going. If you don't know exactly how much you're spending and what you're spending it on, you won't be able to identify which expenses bring happiness or don't, or identify areas to best cut back. So there's lots of tools and tricks in tracking expenses, but it doesn't have to be laborious. Like, some people like to track daily or monthly. I personally like to do a retrospective once every 6 months. And this can be as simple as extracting a CSV or whatever file format that you have access to off your bank and your credit cards. Keeping in mind that some credit cards only go back 4 months online, so you may need to do it every 4 months. And then compile them all into one worksheet in Excel, and then categorize every expense into a category and subcategory. And again, you can find some samples of these online to get you started. But once you've done this, then you can use a pivot table or whatever you're comfortable with to sum up all the categories and see where your money really went. And the longer you do this and the more consistently you do this, the better picture you're going to get and the better feel you're going to get for where your money's actually going and where you can actually cut back. So some online tools have really great visual reporting and budgeting techniques and guidance. So there's one that I use called YNAB. It stands for You Need a Budget. And Pocketsmith and Revolut are some other tools you can use that will automatically track. So Pocketsmith can actually sync with your bank and credit cards. And Revolut is actually a kind of a credit card that you can use that will automatically kind of categorize and give visuals of where your money's going. So those are some tools you can check out that might help you in doing this. Once you've done that and you understand where your money's going, you then need to look at the expenses that bring neither happiness nor unhappiness. So that's your baseline costs. Cutting down on these will not only impact not impact your happiness one way or another, but they'll increase your savings and speed up your time to financial security. So it's a win-win. And in the Central Statistics Office household survey in 2015 in Ireland, the biggest expenses in most households are these baseline costs: your food, accommodation, and transport. It makes up 30% of household expenditure. So if you can look to cut down on these in any way that will not impact your happiness, then that's going to be, a win-win. And then the next step, once you've kind of cut back on those as much as you can, the next cost cuts will be the ones that temporarily reduce your happiness. So things that reduce quality of life a little, but the beauty of the hedonic treadmill concept that we talked about earlier is that just as new purchases temporarily increase your happiness and your baseline expectation rises to meet that, the next time your high isn't as much. But when you're cutting expenses, it actually works for you as well, in that your baseline expectation lowers to meet that cut. So it's only a temporary reduction in happiness. So it'll be temporary, and eventually your happiness level returns to the lower baseline, and you won't experience prolonged decrease in happiness for having cut those expenses. And these will be things like cooking at home instead of eating out, or buying used things instead of new things, for example. The next step then is to try, so it's a trial and error thing, and it's going to be different for everyone. But think of the expenses that will, if you were to cut them, they would permanently affect your well-being. So if you cut them out and your happiness baseline doesn't adapt, your brain doesn't actually re-baseline your expectation, then don't cut those out. But at least you'll know that these are the ones that you've tried to cut out. So these could be things like buying lunch at work, eating out at restaurants, going out with friends, or going to live sporting or music or theater events, things like that. Once you've got your spending down without impacting your happiness, then you can actually increase your happiness even further by adding back in some luxuries. So adding some fun money into your budget. And as long as the amount is less than the amount you saved by cutting in the other areas, you'll still have money left over to build towards your financial security, but your happiness will also be increased and you'll be spending less money to do it. So you'll actually find once you play around with this for quite some time, it does take time to change these things. But once you'll find a point where, as we've demonstrated, we're living on 41,000, eventually 30,000 a year. We still get to travel. We still get to do the things that are important to us. We still have, more time with family, living on one income. And that buys us more time and the things that are important to us. So we still have all of those things on very little money, and our happiness is kind of like, at the same level as it would have been before when we were buying frivolous things that we didn't really need. So you'll actually find that you can live on quite little and actually have increased happiness without the stress of money. Some other tips on justifying expenses that have helped me in terms of when I'm considering buying something, I try and think of these two methods. And sometimes, more often than not, it'll actually convince me not to buy it. So using the 4% rule that we talked about in the other videos, for every €100 that you continually spend, you will need €2,500 invested to passively cover this cost once you reach financial independence. So if you're looking to spend €100 on something, ask yourself, how long does it take me to save €2,500? And that's how much time you're adding to your time to financial freedom. So if it takes you a month to save €2,500, then every time you spend €100, you're adding a month onto the time it's going to take you to financial freedom. Another way to justify costs is it worth the time you spent, the time you exchanged to cover the cost for that? So you make a salary. If you convert costs into the time you worked to pay for it, it can often be a way to really put a different perspective on, is it worth it? So for example, if you're a single person in Ireland earning a salary of 50,000 without applying any non-standard tax credits, you'll be taking home just shy of €37,000 or just over €3,000 a month. If you want to go and spend €2,000 on a holiday, that means you'll have spent almost 3 weeks of your life exchanging your time for money to pay for that. And if it feels like that's worth that amount of time, then it's worth it. But if not, then this method might help you cut back further on expenses you would have otherwise thought nothing of spending money on. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I hope that was of use. And if you like this video, please subscribe for more videos on things like this. And the next video I'm going to do is on investment options in Ireland. So stay tuned.